In the last lecture module, we talked a little bit about the historical genesis of scholasticism. We talked about its methodology and to some extent its ideology. And then we turned our attention to the scientific revolution. Now I want to take a moment to really let the dramatic change in worldviews that's occurring during this period really come into focus. So when we look at scholasticism, when we look at the sort of intellectual inquiry that scholastics engage in, the methodologies that they employ, what we find is that scholasticism is largely focused on understanding and refining the knowledge to be found in existing authoritative texts. And it is doing so through exegetical dialectic. That is, it's identifying lines of argumentation, it's identifying potential conflicts between views, it's identifying possible means of resolution of those conflicts. It is primarily a way of developing a consistent, coherent canon. Now, some of the ideology that we find prominent in scholasticism are essentially Christian reinterpretations of ancient Greek cosmology and Christian interpretations of the relationship between the physical world and the spiritual world. So when we see the scholastic cosmology, it's a Earth-centered cosmology where the Earth is the center of the universe and all things rotate around it, a view that we find in ancient Greece. This is a view that's very congenial to Christianity, where we have a deity who creates the universe for the purpose of serving as a receptacle for humanity. And so it would be shocking if it weren't the case that the universe was really geared towards humanity. Similarly, when we think about the nature of the human body, it's inescapably physical in nature. So there's this division, this tension between the supposition of an immortal soul, a non-physical and immortal entity, and the physical vessel in which it is ensconced. And so there's a great diminishment of knowledge of anatomy and physiology for a great deal of this time. But when we see Basilius come along, like Copernicus, he challenges those tenets of scholasticism. The more you carefully investigate the anatomy and the physiology of the human body, the harder it is to fit that immortal soul and to understand its causal relationships to the physical world. Just as the more you carefully look at a theory about the movement of celestial bodies, the more difficult it is to maintain that the Earth is the center of the universe, when a simpler and much more robust predictive theory would suppose that the Earth is merely one planet orbiting a sun ensconced in a larger universe. Now, this means that both of these important ideological components of scholasticism are being challenged by new theories that are given birth to at the very beginnings of the scientific revolution. And they are challenged on the basis of different kinds of evidence that are offered up in support of those views. So Copernicus's view is based largely on astronomical data about the movement of planets, in part astronomical data that was gathered by Muslim astronomers. And similarly, we find that the physiology that Basilius gives us is a physiology that makes it quite difficult to figure out how it is the immortal soul is going to be interacting with this very physical body. How is it possible that human beings are so fundamentally different from the rest of the natural world? Now, when Descartes comes on the scene, he sees the evidence that's used to justify these views about the nature of the human body and about the nature of the cosmos. And he's sympathetic to this idea of science being driven by empirical observation and to some degree even experimentation as we see in Galileo. But he's not completely abandoning some of the more central tenets of scholasticism. So he believes very strongly in a non-empirical component of rational intuition. And he also does not abandon his mind-body dualism, but rather tries to come up with a story about the interaction between mind and body. So Descartes very much tries to advocate for particular elements as he understands them of the scientific revolution, but he's still, to some extent, grounded in the ideologies of scholasticism as well, even though he would probably resent my saying that. And so when we think about Descartes' meditations, our lecture focuses primarily on it as a work in epistemology. And certainly there is a significant epistemic component to the meditations. But the meditations is a complex work that has many levels to it. And we will focus on the epistemology, but we are also going to focus on the meditations as a rhetorical vehicle for trying to mediate the transition from scholasticism to the scientific revolution. But let's start with the epistemology. Recall that we said epistemology is that area of study of the nature, the sources, and the extent of knowledge. It's interested in questions like what is knowledge? How does one get knowledge? What, if any, connection or structure exists within bodies of knowledge? What can humans and others know? What can't they know? And so on. And these are very much questions that we see actively and implicitly contemplated in the Meditations. The Meditations is very much an epistemic document. But when we open up the Meditations, the first project, while epistemic in nature, is also rhetorical in nature. So Descartes begins the Meditations by articulating his first project of the Meditations, a destructive skeptical project. And he tells us in that first paragraph in the first meditation that I accepted many falsehoods as true in my youth, that what I built upon the foundation of these falsehoods was dubious, and therefore that once in my life I would need to tear down everything and begin anew from the foundations if I wanted to establish a firm and lasting knowledge. So the first project to be executed in the Meditations is this project of tearing apart his old belief edifice, tearing apart his worldview to start from scratch, to rebuild in accordance with his epistemic framework. And so what we see here is a metaphorical example that Descartes is encouraging the people of his time to do, to reconsider, to reevaluate both their methodologies and their ideologies, to try and get some room, some intellectual space in which the scientific revolution can continue to grow and to bear fruit. So this first project, the negative project, is a skeptical project, a project of trying to undermine all his knowledge of the external world. And skepticism, as you'll recall, is the thesis that someone or anyone does not have knowledge with regard to some area or in some domain. Now, external world skepticism differs from more modest skeptical hypotheses in that it denies all knowledge about the external world. The external world skeptical project, then, is the project that Descartes adopts. He wants to undermine all of his claims about the nature of the world. And it's integral to this project that he doesn't just focus on individual isolated instances of forming beliefs or making judgments. Instead, Descartes recognizes the interrelationships between those individual bits and how they tend to serve as mutual support for one another. And this is the contribution, I think, that he makes to the development of robust external world skeptical arguments. So we'll pick things up again in the next module.